On Tuesday, the 18th of January 1977, Wendy Miles would watch her two young daughters leave for a day out with their grandparents. Helen, aged 11, was feeling grown up and excited, as her parents had allowed her to wear a little lipstick for the trip out. And 8-year-old Rosie was carrying her new doll she had just received for Christmas. Wendy would watch the girls walk away down the street with her father Walter and her stepmother Madge. It was the last time Wendy Miles would ever see any of them alive again. But before we explore today's disaster down under, I would like to welcome you guys to the new segment on the channel, Disasters Down Under. This series is going to be about a number of different disasters that have occurred here in Australia over the years. I thought it would be a nice addition to the channel. It's another thing I've always been really interested in, like the anatomy of a disaster, all that kind of thing. So this is what this segment is going to be about. And if you enjoy it, could you please drop me a comment in the comment section below. And I would like to remind you guys to make sure that the like button is wearing its seatbelt. Ensure the subscribe button is in its upright position and its bell has been rung so you don't miss a minute of the action, and that you help me out with a comment, even if you just say hi and share these videos with your mates. It's amazing subscribers just like you who help me grow my presence here on YouTube and allow me to continue making content for you guys just like this. That being said, it's time to take a train ride. The year is 1977. Christmas is freshly over and the new year is kicking into full swing. It's summer and the school holidays are also in high gear. And so was the heat. That year, the mean January heat index was between 30 to 35 degrees Celsius, which is 86 to 96 degrees Fahrenheit. At 6:09 a.m. that morning, the 46 class electric locomotive 4620 had commenced its journey towards Sydney from Mount Victoria in the Blue Mountains. Also at this time in Granville, doctors, nurses, ambulance drivers, firefighters and other emergency personnel were clocking on for the day. Further down the line, young father, Brian Gordon, was running late for work. He had woken with a headache and honestly just wasn't feeling that well. However, his wife had at breakfast presented him with a very sizable bill that needed paying, so he decided he had better go to work. He had boarded the train at one of its many stops after kissing his wife and his daughter goodbye and waving to them as the train departed. Also, on board the Mount Victoria to Sydney commuter train that morning was 19-year-old Debbie Woodgate. Debbie was working at police headquarters in Sydney CBD on January 18, 1977. Debbie was a very happy girl and had everything going for her. She had a wonderful job, good friends, and was looking forward to the future as a policewoman, which Debbie was really excited about. And it was the first time she had ever caught the train to work. Her car wasn't working, there was something wrong with it, so Debbie had originally decided to take the bus. However, the bus arrived much later than Debbie had planned, so she boarded this train. It would turn out to be the worst mistake of her life. Minutes after departing from the Parramatta station, the packed train derailed at Granville. At approximately 8:10 a.m, it was approaching Granville railway station when the locomotive derailed and struck one of the steel and concrete pillars supporting the bridge carrying Bold Street over the railway cutting. Debbie had felt a bit of a shake and thought, oh, what's going on? But she wasn't particularly worried at this point. Brian Gordon, who usually sat in carriage number 2, decided not to that day and was sitting in carriage number 3 when the train came lurching to its stop. Other passengers were saying that the train had derailed, and at this point all that Brian was worried about was being late for work, knowing his pay would be docked if he was late, and he had that big bill his wife had given him at the breakfast table on his mind, and it had to be paid that day. So that was kind of all Brian was thinking about. It was a matter of a moment later, a loud cracking noise would be heard, and the world would go black for the passengers in the rear and to the front of cars 3 and 4. The derailed engine and first 2 carriages passed the bridge. The first carriage, which broke free from the other carriages, was torn open when it collided with a severed mast beside the track, killing 8 passengers. The remaining carriages came to a halt with the second carriage clear of the bridge. The rear half of the third carriage and the forward half of the fourth carriage came to rest right under the weakened bridge, whose weight was estimated at 570 tonnes, 560 long tonnes and 630 short tonnes. Within seconds, with all of its supports demolished, the bridge and several motor cars on top of it collapsed on top of the carriages, crushing the passengers inside them. Debbie Woodgate had survived the initial collision and had then heard yelling and a girl screaming, and Debbie had just completed what they used to call back then a panic course through the police headquarters, and this had taught Debbie to go to aid people that were going through panic and trauma. So Debbie would recount, so there I was 19 and I walked over not believing there was any problems, crouched down and tried to console a young girl who was hiding behind a seat. Then the bridge fell and Debbie was crushed down there. Debbie said at the beginning she heard a few muffles, a few cries and things, but then it was silent and there was nobody around and everything was completely dark. Debbie also heard someone saying the Lord's Prayer, and that actually really frightened her, as she didn't realise the predicament she was in. Understandably, she still would have been in shock, and it was dark, and you would just be completely... I don't even have words. You would just be completely confused. 83 people were killed that day, with another 213 injured. Of the total number of passengers travelling in the third and fourth carriages, half were killed instantly when the bridge fell on them, crushing them in their seats. Several injured passengers were trapped in the train for hours after the accident, with part of the bridge crushing a limb or torso. Some had been conscious and lucid, talking with rescuers, but died of crush syndrome soon after when the weight was removed from their bodies. This resulted in changes to the kind of rescue procedures for these kind of accidents. Rescuers also faced greater difficulties as the weight of the bridge was still crushing the affected carriages, reducing the space in which they had to work to get to the survivors, until it was declared that no one was allowed to attempt further entry until the bridge had been lifted. Soon after, the bridge settled a further 5 centimetres onto the train, trapping 2 rescuers and crushing a portable generator like butter. Another danger came from gas. LPG cylinders were kept year-round on board the train to be used in winter for heating. Several people were overcome by gas leaking from ruptured cylinders. The leaking gas also prevented the immediate use of rescue power tools. The New South Wales Fire Brigade provided ventilation equipment to dispel the gas, and a constant film of water was sprayed over the accident site to prevent the possibility of the gas igniting. The train driver, the assistant crewman, the second man, and the motorists, including 1 motorcyclist driving on the fallen bridge, all survived. The operation lasted from 8:12 a.m. in the morning on Tuesday until 6 a.m. Thursday. Ultimately, 84 people were killed in the accident, including an unborn child. Also killed by crush injuries endured in the disaster was Brian Gordon, who had become trapped after part of the bridge fell across his midsection. Brian had bravely fought for survival, accompanied by an ambulance paramedic who helped him to stay lucid until he was freed near 6 p.m. that night. Unfortunately, while Brian survived his initial injuries, he would tragically succumb to crush syndrome 24 hours later. And crush syndrome is defined as the systemic manifestations resulting from crush injury, which can result in organ dysfunction, and predominantly it affects the kidneys. But multi-system organ injury can also occur, and in most cases death soon follows. And this is from toxins that are released into the bloodstream once the compression has been removed from the affected limbs. Also tragically killed in the disaster that day were Wendy Miles's 2 young daughters, her father and her stepmother. They were killed instantly when the bridge fell, crushing them all, and they were in the middle of carriage number 3. On holidays from England, her father and stepmother had taken the 2 oldest daughters for a day out in the city, but never got to their final destination. Her youngest children were 6 and 4 at the time and have grown up not knowing their elder siblings, and it's something that's haunted these children ever since. And so many other families were affected on that horrible day. But let's head back to the day in question now and find out what happened to Debbie Woodgate. Police rescuer Gary Raymond was one of the first responders to the disaster. Gary would recount, on the way out they kept calling an increasing casualty number, and we looked at each other and we said it was the passenger train. And every few minutes it was more casualties, and we thought we've got something really big here. So he's talking about when he is actually first in the ambulance with his partner, responding to the scene and travelling to the train crash. There were 213 injured in and around that area. Some were just wandering around holding a briefcase, and he would go on to say that he saw one fellow wandering around in circles with his briefcase, and he saw others that were unconscious, and he went down on a rope and over the side and went over and looked under the bridge, and it was then that he saw the 2 crushed carriages full of people, and the majority of them he knew were obviously deceased at this time. Gary and a paramedic crawled through the carriage. His colleague checked on Debbie but could not find any sign of life, but then Gary checked her again, and Debbie had at this point stopped breathing, but she did still have a pulse. And he knew, as an ambulance officer and a rescue operative, if he didn't open Debbie's airway right then and there, she was going to die. In the confines of the crushed carriage, Gary managed to open Debbie's airway. And he would go on to say it was one of the most beautiful sounds that he had ever heard in his entire policing and ambulance career, was when Debbie started to breathe on her own. And Gary was thinking to himself, God, thank you, because the alternative would be that Debbie would have died in Gary's arms. Debbie would go on to say, it's frightening when I think about it, and I think, wow, I'm so grateful. So Debbie stayed there for about 10 hours, and she was the last person to be taken out with very bad injuries. And Debbie would go on to say that she would just love to tell people it was just a broken arm, but it was a lot more than that. Debbie would go on to have a leg amputated below the knee. She had several fractures in various places, and her balance and coordination has always been a little bit off since the accident. And she lost her ability to breathe and was a long time unconscious. Debbie's rescuer has never forgotten the conversations he had with his patient as she lapsed in and out of consciousness in the trapped train carriage. She said to him, "Do you think I'll ever be able to get married and have a baby?" Gary was in a little bit of shock when she said that, so he said to her, "Well, only God knows, but you know what? I actually thought at that time Debbie was going to die," Gary would go on to say. 18 months in the hospital and many more months in rehab, Debbie is now married with a family and describes her daughter Shelby as her miracle baby. And the best thing, this is one of the nicest stories to actually come out of this terrible day, Gary and Debbie catch up for dinner whenever they can, and Debbie is now a successful businesswoman. Gary has retired from the police force and is now a Salvation Army chaplain. Gary and Debbie are still in contact to this day, and their friendship has endured over 40 years since that horrific day in 1977, and as I mentioned before, they like to catch up for dinner as often as they can. Others were not so fortunate. So many lives were altered that day, including the first responders, nurses, doctors, and rescue workers who worked tirelessly in dangerous and sweltering conditions to try to rescue as many survivors as they could. Many personnel on the scene that day experiencing PTSD as a result of the tragedy. Further to this, in a show of the very worst that humanity has to offer during a crisis, it was found looters were robbing the cars of the first responders as they fought in the heat and the gas fumes and at great personal danger to themselves. Several were also arrested by attending police officers as they tried to rob victims trapped within the wreckage. And for this, I honestly have no words. Here's this disaster unfolding, people are trapped, and they're looting and stealing from them, and I will never understand this behaviour as long as I live. As I said, I have no words for this. So we're going to move forward to what caused the tragedy on that sweltering day in January. So we will begin to see a pattern that is usually present during a disaster as we explore each new case, and it's the law of three. There are usually three contributing factors to most disasters. On that hot summer day in 1977, the coroner would find that three factors contributed to what still stands today to be Australia's worst ever railway disaster. The first factor was the speed the locomotive was travelling at as it rounded the bend on the approach to Granville station and the Bold Street Bridge. The posted speed limit for a locomotive travelling that stretch of rail was 72 kilometres per hour. When the train from Mount Victoria rounded that bend on the 18th of January 1977, it was travelling at 82 kilometres per hour, 10 kilometres over the speed limit. It was also at this point that the wheels of the train jumped off the track and the train began to derail. The front wheels of the train were old and extremely worn, due to cost-cutting employed by the government at that time and the fact that that particular class of locomotive was soon to be phased out. All the spare parts for the 46 class had been gotten rid of or had already been used and were now worn out, and there were no new wheels to put on the train to replace the old worn ones, and they didn't bother to purchase any more or keep them because they were cutting costs. Add to this, also due to budget cuts, the track maintenance was also very poor. The original inquiry into the accident found that the primary cause of the crash was the very unsatisfactory condition of the permanent way, being the poor fastening of the track, causing the track to spread and allowing the left front wheel of the locomotive to come off the rail. But the biggest factor was the bridge over Bold Street. The original inquiry into the accident also found that another primary cause of the crash was the unsatisfactory structure of the bridge itself. When built, the base of its deck was found to be 1 metre lower than the road. Concrete was added to the top to build the surface up level with the road. This additional weight significantly added to the destruction of the wooden train carriages, and it was found that the bridge was overweight by over 200, almost 300 tonnes. Also contributing to the disaster was the finding that the bridge has been collided with at least twice before in the previous last 6 to 12 months. 2 different locomotives had also jumped the tracks and collided with the bridge. Fortunately, in these incidences, there was only minimal damage and no casualties. The disaster prompted substantial increases in rail maintenance and expenditure. The train driver, Edward, I'm going to hope I pronounce his last name correctly, Edward Olenzowicz, was exonerated by the inquiry. The Granville Train Disaster Association Incorporated was formed 39 years after the accident to represent those affected. Barry Gobb, Meredith Knight, the Minister for Transport Andrew Constance, and New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian requested an apology for the way the victims of the disaster were treated by the then Rand government of the day. On the 4th of May 2017, Gladys Berejiklian gave a formal apology to the victims of the disaster in New South Wales Parliament House. So, what are the 84 roses? Beginning with the first anniversary of the Granville railway disaster, families, friends and first responders present on what became to be known as Australia's worst ever rail disaster, and later as the Day of the Roses. And in 1998, a two-part documentary was produced for the Channel 7 network about the disaster, and it would be called The Day of the Roses. 84 roses for 84 victims, including an unborn baby, who lost their lives on the 18th of January 1977. 44 men, 37 women, and the 2 young daughters of Wendy Miles. May they never be forgotten. And if you happen to be travelling around Sydney by rail and you get a chance, maybe if you remember the stories in this video, you might like to leave a rose behind to remember the victims. I know I myself will be doing just that if I ever get the opportunity. And with that, our first disaster down under comes to a close. So what do you guys think? Were you around that day in 1977 and perhaps remember hearing about it? Or maybe you knew someone who was involved, or perhaps just remember watching the Day of the Roses on TV and were moved by the stories from that horrific day? I would love to know your thoughts on this case, so please comment in the comment section below. Also, if you have an Australian disaster you would like me to cover in a future video, also pop your suggestions in the comment section, as I'm interested to know what else you'd like me to cover in the future. The Day of the Roses is available right here on YouTube for you to watch for free, and I will leave a link in the description box below. I watched it in preparing myself to do this video, and yeah, it was a lot. I had watched it before, but I was only very young when I watched it before, so the context was more meaningful for me at this age. Yeah, it's just one of those things, you see it, you read about it, you listen to the survivors' stories, you listen to the podcasts, and it's just one of the things you can't believe that it happened. It's like, how did this even happen? But as we've explored, there was a lot of cost cutting employed by the government at that time, and if you happen to watch The Day of the Roses, you will also see that the coroner at the time was being leaned on by the Rand government to fudge his findings and say that it was not the railway's fault or the government's fault, because at the time the government did own the railway and they were trying to lean on him to exonerate themselves of all responsibility. But ultimately, as you'll see if you watch The Day of the Roses, the coroner was a good man and he did do the right thing, and he did find, as we just discussed, that it was the poor track maintenance, it was the cost cutting, and it was the bad condition of the locomotives and the cost cutting procedures that led to the bridge not being completed properly when it was found, that anomaly between the road and the top of the bridge that contributed to this disaster. I am happy to say now that the Bold Street Bridge has been replaced, and it is been replaced with a proper steel and concrete overpass, and there is a memorial that you can visit nearby the accident site at Granville if you would like to go and perhaps place a candle or a bunch of roses there to remember the victims by. There are so many of them, it's going to be hard for me to name them all here. However, I will provide the list of the victims that I found at the end of this video. Also, at the end of this video, I will be providing you guys with numbers that you can call if, in fact, this video has raised any issues for you. Like I said, there's got to be people that remember this day that are watching this, or may have been involved, or had a family member involved, or may have even been one of the first responders. So if you guys need any help, I will be providing numbers that you guys can call if this episode has raised any issues for you. And as always, thank you one and all once again for watching. Stay safe out there, everyone, and I will be seeing you all again very soon. And as always, coming this week sometime, I can't stick to an upload schedule. Life's crazy. But we do have another true crime, real crime down under video coming. There is also another fun and spooky Ozfiles, The Truth Is Out back. And I will be airing a special episode of Missing Down Under, probably on Friday, hopefully. We do have an active case that I want to talk about, as well as a historical case that I will be featuring. So stay tuned for that, especially the Missing Down Under, because there is a girl who is missing right now and the police desperately need help to find her. So I'm hoping to knock that one out in the next couple of days, and hopefully we can get some help for this lady who is currently missing, and get some closure for her family. But anyway, as for today, that's going to do it. Thank you all once again so much for watching, and I will see you all again soon. Bye.